I'm here to be a provocateur, and that's quite interesting because I think in my time zone it's probably about 3 a.m. So I'm going to be relying on collective activity to help stimulate the discussion. Clearly, I'm going to kind of humbly sketch out our best understanding of different pathways into the future of energy out to 2050. And that's significant, but clearly it can only be a sketch. And in the discussion, I'm happy to dive down into any particular topics that come forth, and we can look more detailed at that. And also, I'm with General Mosley, who introduced his 3 grandchildren to us. Thank you for that. My 3 grandchildren are AJ, Zach, and Olivia, and hence I've also got a great interest in the outlook to 2050. So, we have anxieties about the future, and we all share them, whichever aspect of society we come from government, from civic society, from business, and it's also represented in my presentation, this sense of anxiety. Clearly, there may be lawyers here, there may be accountants, and so basically what this lays out is, this is humbly our best understanding. But if you misunderstand me and lose your pension fund, that's not my fault. Actually, I've read the details. It says it's not Shell's fault. Let me pick up. I mean, clearly, what we are talking about is people here. People and their quest for better lives for themselves, for their children, for their family, for their community. And I put this up just as a reminder as to where the weight of population is in the world. This is a graph of the world in sense of current population. Do we have any Australians here? I am sorry, sir, this is not meant to offend, this particular way of showing the outlook. If it's any help, I don't know if there are any New Zealanders here, but you can see New Zealand on this map as well. Of course, the purpose of showing this is to remind everybody that the center of world population is in Asia. That's why we're here. But that isn't the only point. It's not only that we have population growth, but we also have much needed growth in prosperity as millions of people are moving out of quite dire material circumstances into a better standard of living. And as they do that, they actually enter the most energy-intensive phase of economic development. Clearly, you can see that there is an energy ladder. And as you move from the pre-industrialized phase into the industrialization phase, the energy use per head on average grows rapidly, and then it begins to level off as you enter a more service-oriented phase of economic development. Now, this actually underlines one very important hard truth, which is that there is a surge in energy demand, and it will go on for decades as populations increasingly enter this phase of development. And in fact, by 2050, if there were no constraints on that, the underlying demand for energy would be 3 times the level that it was in the year 2000. That's the first hard truth. Now, there are other hard truths around supply, because while supply will grow in response to this demand, the underlying supply for technical, for financial, and for political reasons cannot grow at that same pace. So that means there will be supply-demand tensions that are increasingly prominent in the decades ahead. And clearly, this level of activity brings environmental stresses as well, which is one of the overarching discussion points of this conference. So transitions are inevitable, and this is just to give an example of transitions, but also different types of transitions. Clearly, in developed economies, such as in Europe or in the USA, you see what I call the rainbow effect as energy intensity is reducing over time. Energy efficiency increases, that you get a rainbow of other energy sources which begin to increasingly replace the primary energy sources that are dominant today of coal, oil, and gas. The story of the emerging markets, of course, is that they emerge. They use more of everything, and that is helping to underpin this movement of so many hundreds of millions of people out of dire material circumstances. But of course it has consequences. So you can see here growth in the use of oil and gas and coal in the coming decades. So when we look at how these pathways may proceed, we found in Shell in a 40-year history of using scenarios to help us wrestle with this. And people are more familiar with forecasts, so I'll just draw a bit of a distinction between scenarios and forecasts. Forecasts look at the world, project forward trends, are often based on deep analysis. We do a lot of forecasting for the short term based on deep analysis, but they tend to then project one pathway into the future, which can be helpful because it causes people to align their behavior, their choices against this pathway, but it can also be unhelpful because it doesn't recognize the reality of the world, which is that people are people, and people make choices individually, as consumers, as citizens, and collectively through governments and other institutions. And those choices shape different outcomes. So you both have predetermined trends, but you also have different outcomes. And so we have to look at the current realities of worldviews and mindsets and project what those mean when played out over time. And Mr. Cullinan earlier recognized this when he spoke of different worldviews, different mindsets. And you'll see this reflected in the scenario work. So the Shell energy scenarios take a huge amount of analysis, but also project them through the lens of different patterns of choice. And we've actually found that you can sketch out the future landscape quite well through considering two archetypal patterns of choice, which we call scramble and blueprints. I can say a little bit more about them, but just to give you a sense, scramble looks at this world and says the primary actors are national actors with a concern about competing for supply. Demand is important, but that's in the background because demand management is politically much, much more difficult and sensitive than supply management, than negotiating a bilateral deal or incentivizing the local production of a resource, whether that is a coal resource or a wind resource. But that leads to relatively sluggish change in the policy and technological underpinning of the energy system over the decades ahead. Another outlook we call blueprints. And this recognizes that whilst those actors have those concerns, there are also other actors which may have a considerable influence about them, which are actors acting at below national level or cross-national level. So, as an example, we're gathering here also in the context of the C40 group of cities, which are major cities sharing best practices and policy objectives around environmental and other issues, and that can help accelerate change. Back in California in 2005, you had an emerging coalition of wealthy technology entrepreneurs, farmers concerned about water issues, and a Republican governor who was in deep political trouble, recognizing a new mutual interest, so not altruism, but a new mutual interest, which led to the formation of Assembly Bill 32, which led to provisions for, from 2012, market-based responses to climate issues in California, and that spread up into other states on the west coast of the US and onto the east coast, and has led to a number of different initiatives, and of course have affected the debate at federal level quite considerably. So if I just quickly run through, just if you add up all the numbers, what these different patterns of behavior entail. So the scramble outlook begins now, of course, and begins with this surge in energy. And you can see a great deal of that surge is taken up with coal. In the last decade, 40% of all energy growth worldwide has been in coal. But then, in the later part of this decade already, you're running into these very tight squeeze on supply-demand. Coal cannot continue to grow at that explosive pace, mainly because of logistical considerations, the number of railroads and new ports that need to be built in order to transport that amount of coal around. Similarly, conventional sources of oil, for both technological and political reasons and financial reasons, will not be able to grow at that same pace. So this is a period of a discontinuity. This is an uncomfortable period. Governments respond to that, of course, by new policies to knee-jerk reduce transport. So we go back to only certain days being able to drive, to the forced scrapping of the oldest and least energy-efficient plants. And of course, you get huge price spikes, which encourage the development of other developments. And so in the course of the next decade, you begin to get a rebound as you get an enforced rebalancing of the system. If you look at the right-hand chart, you see the impact on the CO2 emissions from energy, which again surge and then plateau. But they only begin to reduce late in the period when you begin to get such turbulence in the climate that is blamed on lack of response before, that you have the political conditions to go beyond talking and into action. Let me now sketch out the Blueprints outlook. Blueprints begins with this patchwork of developments. Dr. Richard Sandor mentioned the European trading scheme and cap and trade in different areas. You also get performance standards, which are ways of, in fact, having hidden carbon dioxide prices, not necessarily the most efficient way of acting, but a patchwork of developments. And that includes the pricing of carbon dioxide. Now, patchworks then institute a new dynamic, because patchworks are recognized by policymakers and industrialists as reducing trade and reducing investment, and hence these patchworks are then progressively harmonized. So you don't get a top-down UN-led type of blueprint. You get several blueprints which merge and begin to reduce the energy intensity of economic growth and the carbon intensity of energy growth. The pricing of emissions also helps incentivize the bringing through of new technologies, such as deep electrification, electrification of power with lower carbon resources, whether that's wind or solar, or indeed natural gas, which is a low carbon resource, particularly effective when combined with a technology like carbon dioxide capture and storage. So you can see in this particular outlook the turnaround in emissions profile from energy by around about 2020, and it is on a reducing pathway by 2050.